What if I told you that one of the richest men in America nearly walked past the very person who once kept his empire shining, only to find her freezing on a park bench? This is not a fairy tale. This is not another rags to riches cliché. This is a story that will challenge what you think you know about power, money, and humanity. A millionaire. A maid. One cold night in Boston. What happened next shocked everyone. And it didn't just change 2 lives. It ignited a movement that spread far beyond the walls of one mansion. Stay with us until the very end, because this is more than just a story. It's a mirror. And once you see it, you won't look at the world the same way again. What if I told you that one simple decision, just 10 minutes late, could change the course of 2 lives forever? Not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, but on a freezing park bench in Boston. This is not just another story about wealth and poverty colliding. This is about what happens when someone society calls invisible finally gets seen. Stay with me, because the ending is not what you think. My name is Elena Carter. For 3 long years, I scrubbed marble floors, polished silver trays, folded linen so crisp they could cut your fingers. I worked in the mansion of Richard Hale, the CEO of Hale Global Properties, one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast. Richard was the kind of man who could close a multi-million-dollar deal before breakfast, then fly to Miami for lunch without ever glancing at the people who ironed his shirts or poured his wine. And me? I was just the maid. Quiet, quick, invisible. I never expected him to remember my last name. I only prayed he wouldn't notice the holes in my shoes or the way my hands cracked from bleach and cold water. For 3 years, I kept my head down. Until the morning everything unraveled. It was a December morning, the kind where the sky turns gray before the sun even rises. The kind of cold that slices through coats and sinks straight into bone. I had walked 3 miles from the small pharmacy that finally refilled my mother's prescription. My hands were still red from gripping the paper bag too tight. By the time I reached the mansion gates, I was 10 minutes late. 10 minutes. Richard was already pacing the foyer when I walked in, snow clinging to my uniform, hair dripping from the sleet. He didn't even raise his eyes at first. When he did, his expression was sharper than the wind outside. "You're dismissed," he said. At first, I thought I misheard him. "Sir?" My voice was barely a whisper. He repeated it, colder this time. "You're dismissed. You're not reliable. No questions. No explanation. No chance to explain why my mother's medicine mattered more than his polished staircase. Just those 2 words. You're dismissed." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My pride was heavier than my voice. So I nodded. And I walked away. What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had nowhere else to go. For months, I had been sleeping on a thin mattress in the storage room behind the wine cellar. I sent almost every dollar I earned back home to Louisiana for Mama's treatments and for my younger brother's food. I had no apartment, no working phone, not even bus fare. That morning, when I stepped out of the mansion gates, the world felt wider than ever and crueler than ever. The shelters were already full. The friends I once leaned on had drifted far away. And the truth? I was too ashamed to ask anyone for help. So I walked until my legs gave out. Past storefronts glowing with Christmas lights I could never afford. Past bankers hurrying with leather gloves and hot coffee. Past people who looked right through me as if I were part of the sidewalk. Finally, I collapsed onto a bench near Tremont Street, just blocks away from Boston's financial district. I told myself I'd rest just for a moment. just a moment to catch my breath, to let the sting in my cheeks fade. But the moment stretched and stretched. The snow kept falling, piling onto my thin blue uniform. My fingers curled inward, too stiff to move. My eyes drifted shut, heavy as stone. That's the last thing I remember. And yet, across town, the man who had just fired me was about to face a disruption of his own. For the first time in years, Richard Hale's carefully constructed schedule would collapse. His driver had called off because of black ice. His assistant's emails were delayed. And for once, Richard had to walk to his own meeting. It was only a 10-minute walk. 10 minutes he despised. 10 minutes he would have gladly paid someone else to take for him. But those 10 minutes were about to change everything. Richard Hale hated walking. He had once joked that sidewalks were for people who hadn't figured out life yet. For him, the world was meant to be traveled in black sedans with tinted windows and leather seats. But that morning, with his driver stuck at home on icy roads, Richard had no choice. The air outside bit at his face. His breath fogged in the frigid air as he tightened the collar of his cashmere coat. Boston's streets were slick with slush, and manhole covers hissed steam like tired ghosts rising from the underground. Every step made him more irritated. Every gust of wind reminded him that he didn't belong out here, among the rush of ordinary people. But irritation turned into something else entirely when his eyes landed on a figure slumped against a snow-covered bench. At first, she looked like nothing more than a pile of discarded laundry, a bundle of faded blue cloth half buried in frost. People walked past without slowing down. A businessman with earbuds, a woman pulling her dog away, a group of college kids laughing, not even glancing in her direction. Richard almost did the same. Almost. But something in that shape, the way her hand curled against her chest, the way her hair clung to her cheek, pulled him back. He slowed. He turned. And then he froze. It wasn't just a stranger, it was Elena, the maid he had dismissed only hours before. The woman who used to quietly make sure his fireplace was lit before he came downstairs. The one who replaced towels in his gym without a word. The one he had fired over 10 minutes of lateness. Now she lay motionless, snow piling on her uniform, lips pale, body trembling in the bitter cold. For a heartbeat, Richard stood rooted to the ground, torn between instinct and habit. His instinct screamed help her. His habit whispered walk away. After all, hadn't he already decided she was disposable? But when her name slipped out of his mouth, barely audible, Elena, he realized there was no turning back. He rushed forward, kneeling in the slush. His gloved hand brushed her arm, and he recoiled at the sensation. Her skin was ice, not the kind of cold you get from a short walk outside, but the terrifying metallic cold of a body shutting down. "Stay with me," Richard muttered, though she didn't stir. Panic rose, sharp and unfamiliar. Deals falling apart, investors backing out, those things had rattled him before. But this was different. This was human. This was survival. With fumbling fingers, he yanked his phone from his coat pocket and dialed 911. "There's a woman," he said, voice cracking. "She's unconscious. She's freezing. I need an ambulance right now." The dispatcher kept him on the line, asking questions he barely processed. Was she breathing? Barely. Was there a pulse? Weak, fading. Did he know her? Yes, and no. He knew her name, her work, her silence, but in that moment he realized how little he had ever seen her. Snowflakes clung to his eyelashes as he brushed the frost from her shoulders. His expensive coat grew heavier as the snow soaked into the wool, but he didn't care. He sat beside her, murmuring words he wasn't even sure she could hear. "I'm sorry." Please hold on. Help is coming. Minutes dragged like hours. Every time her chest stilled, his own heart lurched. Every time a passerby glanced at them, he snapped back, "Call for help," even though he was already on the line. And then, finally, the wail of sirens cut through the winter silence. Red lights reflected off icy windows as the ambulance pulled up to the curb. Paramedics rushed out, lifting Elena onto a stretcher, wrapping her in thick blankets, oxygen mask pressed against her face. Richard stayed close, ignoring the slush soaking his knees. He couldn't let go. Not yet. One of the EMTs looked at him. "Are you family?" Richard hesitated. "No," he admitted, his voice low. "But don't let her go alone." "I'll follow." They loaded her into the ambulance. Doors slammed shut. The vehicle sped away, tires hissing on the icy road. Richard stood there for a long moment, coat heavy, gloves wet, chest heaving. The city moved around him, horns blaring, footsteps hurrying, but for the first time in years, his schedule didn't matter. Only she did. And in that frozen instant, Richard Hale, the man who thought sidewalks were beneath him, realized he had just taken the most important walk of his life. The first thing I felt was weight. Not on my arms, not on my legs, on my chest like a heavy stone pressing down each time I tried to breathe. When I opened my eyes, the room was blurred. White walls, harsh fluorescent light humming above me. The smell of disinfectant burned my nose. My throat was raw, my lips cracked. Every inhale rattled with a sharp, icy ache. For a moment, I thought I was dead. Then my vision cleared, and I saw him. Richard Hale. The man who had fired me. The man whose voice had cut sharper than the winter wind. The man who had walked away from me 100 times in his grand hallway. He was sitting in a plastic hospital chair. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie half loosened, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot, hollow-snapped open the moment mine flickered awake. "You're alive," he whispered, like the words were a prayer. My lips trembled, my voice cracked. "Am I dead?" He shook his head hard. "No, you're safe now. You're here." Confusion washed over me. Why was he here? Why wasn't he back in his glass towers, sipping whiskey while his investors lined up calls? I forced the words out, broken and weak. "Why? Are you here?" For the first time in the years I'd known him, Richard Hale didn't answer quickly. He didn't deflect. He didn't hide behind clipped orders or practiced speeches. He lowered his gaze, rubbed his temple, and said something I never thought I'd hear. "Because I should have seen you." And I didn't. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. I blinked at him, my chest hitching with each shallow breath. I had dreamed of apologies before. I had whispered them into the dark, when I was curled up on that thin mattress behind the wine cellar. But I never imagined they would sound real. Tears burned my eyes, not because of the pain, not because of the cold still clinging to my body, but because I knew he meant it. "I wasn't late on purpose," I whispered. "I walked all night." "Mama needed medicine. I didn't sleep. I tried. God, I tried." Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low and unsteady. "And I never asked. I just assumed. That's my shame, not yours." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy-like. Both of us were finally standing in the same truth. The nurse slipped into the room, checked the machines, scribbled something on her chart. She looked at Richard. "You should rest, sir." But he didn't move. "I'll stay," he said simply. The nurse frowned. "It's going to be a long night." He nodded. "Then it's a night I'll spend here." She left without another word, and the door clicked shut. I turned my face to the wall, hot tears slipping down my cheeks. No one had stayed for me like that in a long time. Not since Mama's stroke. Not since the friends who promised to visit disappeared one by one. And yet, here he was. Not my brother. Not family. The last man I expected. Richard didn't sleep. I could hear the quiet rustle of his coat as he shifted, the low murmur of him speaking words I couldn't always catch. Maybe to me, maybe to himself. Apologies, regrets, promises he didn't yet know how to keep. By morning, the snow outside had stopped. The city was blanketed in white, sparkling in the first thin rays of sun. But inside that sterile hospital room, something else had begun to thaw. Richard Hale had spent decades building towers of steel and glass. He had armored himself with money, status, and silence. But one freezing night, one forgotten maid had cracked the armor wide open. And whether he liked it or not, nothing would ever be the same. By the time Elena was stable, 3 days had passed. 3 days of Richard pacing hospital corridors. 3 days of him answering no calls, attending no meetings, signing no contracts. For a man who had once lived minute by minute, deal by deal, it was unthinkable. But guilt has a way of rearranging priorities. When Elena was strong enough to walk with assistance, Richard insisted she move into the guest wing of his mansion. Not as staff, not as the help, but as someone who needed warmth, rest, and dignity. She resisted at first, pride clashing with desperation. In the end, the steady promise in his voice broke through. "This isn't charity," he told her, handing her a heavy wool coat and a pair of boots. "It's correction." That night, Richard stood alone in the echoing marble foyer of his estate. The chandelier glittered above him, but the house felt emptier than ever. The silence gnawed at him. For years he had prided himself on efficiency, on cutting out noise. But now the quiet sounded like judgment. So he called everyone in: the housekeeper, the gardener, the driver, the chef, the assistant who had emailed him 6 times about a missed investor call. They gathered under the chandelier, shifting uneasily. Richard Hale had never summoned them like this before. Never. He clasped his hands behind his back, eyes fixed on the polished floor. His throat tightened. For a man who spoke to Fortune 500 executives with ease, these words felt heavier than steel. "I owe you all an apology," he began. The staff glanced at each other, startled. He had never strung those words together in their presence. "I fired Elena Carter last week," he continued, voice low, "for being late. 10 minutes late. I never asked why. I didn't care. And because of that decision, she nearly froze to death on a park bench, alone. Because of me, the air seemed to stop moving." The gardener shifted uncomfortably. The chef, Mrs. Dowling, raised a trembling hand to her mouth, eyes glistening. "I can't undo what I did," Richard went on, lifting his gaze at last. "But I refuse to pretend it didn't happen. I've built towers across this country. I've negotiated contracts worth billions. But none of that means a thing if I can't even see the people who stand right in front of me." He paused, chest heaving, the words tearing something open inside him. "That's not success. That's blindness." For the first time in 2 decades, Richard Hale, the man whose signature could move markets, spoke the 2 hardest words of his life. "I'm sorry." The staff stood frozen. His assistant fumbled with his tablet, as if searching for an escape in the glow of the screen. Mrs. Dowling let out a soft sob. The driver looked at the ground, jaw tight. No one spoke. And yet, something shifted. That night, Richard sat with Elena in the guest wing's lounge, a fire flickering in the hearth. She looked healthier already, her face still pale but no longer gray, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. "There's something I need you to see," she said quietly. She handed him a notebook, its pages filled with tight handwriting. Notes, observations, stories. 16-hour shifts, Richard read aloud, flipping through. No paid overtime, injuries ignored, promises broken. His eyes widened. How did I miss all this? Elena didn't soften her answer. Because you never looked. The words hit him harder than any shareholder's complaint ever had. For hours, they went through her notes. Richard listened, at first defensive, then stunned, then silent. The world he thought he ruled was rotting at the roots, and he had been blind to it. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling. His voice was low, steady. "What if I gave you authority to fix this? Not just here, everywhere, every property I own." Elena blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "What are you saying?" Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside was a job description, a salary breakdown, a company chart with a new title etched at the top. Director of Care and Ethics, Hale Global Properties. Her hand trembled as she lifted the paper. "You trust me with this?" Richard met her eyes. For once, there was no arrogance there, no polished armor, just sincerity. "I've never trusted anyone more." Elena didn't answer that night. She carried the folder back to her room, closed the door, and sat on the bed staring at it under the soft glow of a lamp. The role was real, the power was real, but the fear was real too. Could she, a woman who once folded napkins in silence, now hold the authority to change lives? Could she walk into boardrooms where people used to look right through her and be heard? She flipped to the last page of the offer letter. One line made her throat tighten. "You are not a second thought. You are the future we should have seen sooner." For the first time in years, Elena let the tears come freely. Not because of pain, but because she felt, perhaps for the very first time, seen. Elena Carter didn't accept the offer that night. She stared at the folder until the lamp beside her buzzed and flickered. She traced her finger over the words, Director of Care and Ethics. Her heart pounded. For years, she had been invisible, blending into hallways, washing dishes no one remembered using. Now, Richard Hale was asking her to step into a room where her voice could rewrite the rules. The next morning, she walked into his study, folder pressed to her chest. Richard stood when she entered, a gesture he had never once offered before. "I'll do it," she said simply. He didn't smile wide. He didn't clap his hands. He just nodded once, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And from that moment, everything began to shift. Her first assignment took her to Hale Global's high-rise in downtown New York. The building glittered with glass and steel, a monument to wealth. But Elena didn't walk straight to the executive suites. She walked to the basement, to the laundry rooms, to the break spaces with plastic chairs and humming vending machines. She sat across from janitors who had worked 20 years without a raise. She listened to housekeepers who whispered about back injuries they paid for out of pocket. She asked them the questions no one had asked before. "Do you feel safe working here? Do you have someone to turn to when things go wrong? What would fairness look like to you?" At first, they hesitated. They shifted in their seats, glanced at the floor, wary of speaking out. But slowly, stories poured out like water breaking through a dam. One woman confessed she hadn't had a single day off in 6 months. A gardener said his overtime hours vanished from payroll. A cook admitted she was afraid of losing her job if she asked for insurance. Elena wrote everything down. Every detail. Every tear. Every silence that said more than words. When she returned to Boston, she handed Richard a thick stack of notes. He read them late into the night, his jaw tight, his hands trembling. "How did this happen under my name?" he whispered. "Because no one was looking," Elena replied. Weeks turned into months. Elena traveled from penthouses in Chicago to seaside estates in Miami. She sat with staff in cluttered kitchens, crowded laundry rooms, sunburnt gardens. Everywhere she went, she carried the same notebook. With each page, she built something bigger than herself. A framework, a system, a movement. It became known as the Invisible No More Initiative. The policies were simple but revolutionary. Guaranteed days off, emergency funds for families in crisis, fair overtime pay, access to health care without intimidation or confusion. For every policy she wrote, Richard signed without hesitation. And more than that, he began showing up. Once a month, he sat in employee break rooms himself. No three-piece suits, no leather briefcases, just Richard Hale sitting shoulder to shoulder with cooks, drivers, and gardeners, asking them what needed to change. The effect was electric. Staff who had once avoided eye contact now spoke freely. Janitors laughed with him. Cooks brought him recipes. For the first time, Hale Global felt less like a fortress of glass and more like a community. And then came the gala. It was a spring evening in Boston. Crystal chandeliers glowed in the mansion's ballroom. Guests in silk gowns and designer suits sipped champagne as a string quartet played softly. It was the kind of event where people expected speeches about profits, portfolios, and prestige. But when Richard tapped the microphone, the room hushed. "I've spent my life building towers," he said, his voice carrying across marble walls. "I thought that made me powerful. But I was wrong. True power is not in steel or glass. It's in dignity, and I had to learn that lesson the hard way." He turned, eyes settling on Elena, standing near the back of the room in a navy dress he had insisted on buying her. "She showed me that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it endures in silence, until someone finally decides to listen. Tonight, I want you to meet the woman who changed everything." All eyes turned. Elena froze. Hundreds of faces, investors, journalists, lawyers, looked at her with curiosity, with awe. Her hands shook as she stepped onto the stage. She hadn't prepared a speech. She hadn't even planned to speak. But when she reached the microphone, she let her heart guide her. "I used to think power meant owning something," she began, "controlling something. But I know now. Real power is about lifting someone else, about seeing them when the world doesn't, about asking one simple question, 'Are you okay?' before it's too late." Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "For a long time, I was invisible. But I'm not anymore. And neither are the people who work quietly in the shadows of homes and offices everywhere. We are not invisible. Not anymore." The ballroom erupted in applause, not polite, not obligatory, thunderous. Some guests rose to their feet, others wiped tears from their eyes. And backstage, as the crowd's clapping echoed through the hall, a young woman in a catering uniform approached her. Her name tag read, Mariah. "Miss Carter," she whispered, voice trembling. "Your story. That was me last year. I was homeless, working nights, trying to feed my little sister. But hearing you, I feel seen again." Elena took her hand, tears stinging her own eyes. "You're not invisible either. Don't ever forget that night. The applause faded. The chandeliers dimmed. The guests went home. But the ripple had already begun. And none of them could have predicted just how far it would spread." A year later, the snow returned. Soft, white, quiet. The city looked almost the same as it had that night on Tremont Street. But for me, everything had changed. I walked back to that very bench, the one where my body almost gave up, the one where Richard found me half buried in frost. But it wasn't just a bench anymore. Now, a bronze plaque gleamed across the backrest. May we never overlook the invisible? I brushed the snow off with my glove, sat down, and closed my eyes. Not to sleep, not to surrender. To remember. I remembered the girl who once wore duct-taped boots, the girl who walked all night to buy medicine, the girl who thought silence was the only dignity she had left. She almost disappeared. But she didn't. Because one man finally saw her. That spring, I was invited to a national summit on labor ethics in Chicago. The room buzzed with CEOs, policymakers, journalists, the very people who had once lived in glass towers, blind to the people who scrubbed their floors. I stood on stage, lights burning hot against my face. My hands shook. But my voice was steady. I told them everything. How I lost my home, how I slept in a storage closet, how I was fired for being 10 minutes late, how I nearly froze to death, and how a single decision, one moment of seeing changed, not just my life, but thousands more. We don't just need new policies, I said into the microphone. We need new eyes. We need leaders who will ask the quiet question, "Are you okay?" before it's too late. Because no one should disappear in silence, the applause that followed shook the hall. Some stood, some cried, and afterwards, 2 CEOs approached me, asking how to start their own employee care programs. The ripple was becoming a wave. Meanwhile, Richard Hale was facing a new kind of spotlight. He hadn't sought it. In fact, he avoided interviews. But word had spread about the Invisible No More initiative. Months later, at a private ceremony in Washington, Richard was handed the Human Dignity Award. He stood at the podium, the trophy gleaming under the lights. He looked out at the audience, then down at the award in his hands. "I don't deserve this alone," he said, because the real shift didn't start with a policy or a headline. It started with one woman, one moment of truth, and a very cold bench. He never said my name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. That weekend, Richard invited me and my family for dinner. Not as staff, not as guests, as equals. Mama wore her Sunday best, her walker gliding gently across polished floors. My younger brother Emmanuel couldn't stop talking about his college plans. Richard sat at the table with us, laughing, passing cornbread, listening to Mama tease him about his cooking. For the first time, I saw what healing looked like. Not speeches, not headlines, but laughter across a kitchen table. The initiative spread to over 30 corporations within a year. We built training programs for managers. We launched an online portal for workers to report unsafe or unfair treatment. The stories poured in from janitors, nannies, cooks, drivers. Every story mattered. Every voice was recorded. And with each one, I felt a little more of the past lift off my shoulders. One morning, I walked into my office at Hale Global. Yes, my office. Sunlight spilled across the cream rug. On the desk sat a framed photo of Mama smiling in her church hat, and another of Emmanuel high-fiving Richard at his college orientation. Pinned on the wall was a letter I had written to myself months before. Dear Elena, you were never invisible. The world just needed new eyes to see you. You were never small. They just never looked deep enough. You were never weak. Not when you walked miles without food. Not when you slept on the floor to send money home. Not when you endured it all with grace. You changed everything. Don't forget that. Every morning, I read it before I began my work. One afternoon, a package arrived at my desk, wrapped in navy blue paper. Inside was a framed photo me, walking onto the gala stage, back straight, dress flowing. Beneath it, in bold letters, the woman who changed the mirror. I smiled through tears. Richard Hale had sent it with no note. He didn't need one. And so here I am, telling you this story. Not because I demanded recognition, not because I asked for pity, but because I endured long enough to deserve to be heard. Redemption is not about charity, it's about dignity. It's about seeing the invisible and lifting them up. And maybe, just maybe, it's about stopping for a closer look. So let me ask you, watching right now, have you ever walked past someone without really seeing them? It only takes one choice, one pause, one act of awareness. That's how you change a life. That's how you change a legacy. And so what began as a cold December morning ended as something far greater, a legacy of dignity. Elena Carter was no longer invisible. Richard Hale was no longer blind. And together they proved that redemption is not about charity. It's about seeing the unseen. It's about listening before it's too late. But here's the question for you. How many times have you walked past someone at a bus stop, on a street corner, in your own building without really seeing them? How many lives slip into silence because no one bothers to ask? One act of awareness changed everything for Elena. One act of courage reshaped an empire. And if it can happen in Boston, it can happen anywhere. So if this story moved you, share it, not just for us. Share it for the people in your life who deserve to be seen. Because the invisible are all around us. And sometimes, all it takes is one person choosing to look closer. This has been Celebrity Undercover Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because the next story might just change the way you see the world.